So, yes, we did just completely kill a character that had raised to level 6 with no death's door, no nothing. We just took them away. And by that time you probably put, I don't know, 10 hours in that character, maybe a little more, who knows. Hopefully it wasn't, well, actually if it was Reynald or Dismas, that's maybe all the more meaningful. The tutorial characters, of course. So yeah, that's a terrible design decision. Like, that's a rage-inducing thing. But we're so happy we did it. We couldn't be happier, actually.
This clip, taken from Tyler Sigmund's design post-mortem of Darkest Dungeon, has stuck with me in the years since I first saw it. Here, Sigmund is talking about the decision to include a mechanic in the final boss fight of the game, where the player must permanently kill 2 of their party members who, by virtue of being a part of this fight, are likely among the player's strongest and most valuable characters. He describes it as rage-inducing, but in my case it has led to more of a sitting frustration. This frustration doesn't arise from the fact that I had to kill my heroes. At this point in the game, I wasn't particularly concerned with keeping all my heroes alive. In my case, I feel frustrated because this moment in the game, juxtaposed with his explanation for its inclusion, signaled to me he didn't really understand the experience he had crafted for his players. Finally, I felt that I understood why Darkest Dungeon, a truly great game, has such a bad ending. Darkest Dungeon is a unique, turn-based RPG set in a world of eldritch horror. Boiling the gameplay down into its simplest elements, the player composes a party of up to 4 characters and embarks on a quest into one of several locations on the map in search of resources and to better prepare their chosen heroes for the final and most difficult locale of the game, the Darkest Dungeon itself. However, what makes the game unique is that instead of having to manage just the hero's health, the player must also manage their stress, vices, and virtues. The selection of heroes is vast, and each feels like they are part of this unique world, but also unique in themselves, and the player is able to explore the depth of mixing and matching different party compositions, their skills, and their items. When a player has finally composed a party that they feel is prepared enough, they can delve into the Darkest Dungeon, where eventually they will enter the aforementioned boss battle. However, when a hero dies, they stay dead, and the game is constantly autosaving, so decisions are permanent. In my opinion, it's a greatly challenging and satisfying experience if you choose to completely disregard its ending. The ending that comes directly after the conclusion of this battle, and the sacrifice of the player's heroes. Sigmund knew that a moment like this may leave some lingering negative emotions, but for me, it wasn't until after the game's ending and seeing this post-mortem that I became upset about its inclusion. In fact, before seeing his talk, I thought it was simply a mechanic intended to make the final boss battle a bit more challenging, and it was one I agreed with. My resentment of this particular mechanic is due to Sigmund's belief of why I should be made to sacrifice my heroes. As it turns out, his aim was to provoke an emotional response. That expectation is what turned out to be upsetting. He elaborates on the mechanic by saying,
And Darkest Dungeon has been about loss the whole time, and so yeah, we're a little cheap, and we make you remember that even more.
Unfortunately, I think his view may have been a bit insular. I don't believe Darkest Dungeon is about loss at all. The very first thing a player sees when they start Darkest Dungeon is this screen. It's a message from the designers to the player that warns them about what is to come, as well as a disclaimer to those who might otherwise not understand or accept their inevitable losses. Certainly, this is a message that alludes to loss, but it is simultaneously a call to action. I believe the game actually goes to extreme lengths to subvert a player's natural emotional response to loss, and this screen is one key element in doing that by warning you that you will lose. I embraced this message as a player as a sign of what was to come, tough losses and hard-fought triumphs. It felt to me like a contract. I can't speak for every player's experience, but as someone who actively chose to buy into the game's message, I came to view my heroes as soldiers in our war against corruption, ones who I shouldn't become too attached to because the possibility of defeat was lurking around every corner. There are several quotes from the game's narrator that encapsulate this feeling when dismissing a hero from the roster.
Slumped shoulders, wild eyes, and a stumbling gait. This one is no more good to us. This one has become vestigial, useless. The task ahead is terrible, and weakness cannot be tolerated.
It seems to me that the game actively works to disconnect the player from the feeling of loss in the name of the greater good. Unfortunately, there is no greater good, and that's because, as I said, Darkest Dungeon isn't really a game about loss, as Sigmund states. It is in fact a game about helplessness. It's tricky to design a game whose theme is helplessness because if your goal is to deliver on a player experience of helplessness, it's actually quite easy to be successful. If you want the player to feel helpless, you can kill their characters, take away their controls, and even destroy their save files. But in seeking to make a player feel helpless through narrative and themes, you should also consider that what makes a story in games different from a story in films and novels is the agency of its audience. Helplessness is, in contrast, defined by a lack of agency. To illustrate this point, I'd like to compare the short story I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream to its video game adaptation. The short story is perhaps one of the bleakest depictions of the future to have ever been written. It centers around the 5 last remaining humans in a post-apocalyptic world that is controlled by a godlike and sentient artificial intelligence called M. M is a being driven solely by his hatred of humankind, and his only enjoyment is in torturing his victims. Their suffering persists for over 100 years until, in the end, his victims manage to defy him only by taking one another's life, with the exception of the story's protagonist, who cannot take his own life in time. In order to ensure that the protagonist will suffer for eternity, Am turns him into a great soft jelly thing, incapable of rendering harm to himself and giving rise to the terrifying phrase, "I have no mouth and I must scream." In contrast, while the video game adaptation of the story allows the player to receive an ending that is just as bleak as the original, there are also several more optimistic endings. According to Ellison, the author of the story and co-designer of the game, he wanted to design the adaptation as a game you cannot possibly win, but he apparently recognized that this design philosophy, in his own words, annoyed the hell out of people. Ellison originally wanted to stay true to his concept of the original story, but was convinced out of it by others working on the game. I believe the reason is that a game that defies the agency of its audience, in the end, feels a bit pointless as a game. I try to think of other games that end with telling the player that their actions affected no change, that their entire experience, summed up, was meaningless, not just that the game's ending was sad or disappointing, but that from beginning to end, every action the player took, every decision they made, contributed to absolutely nothing. The only one I can think of is Darkest Dungeon.
Victory. A hollow and ridiculous notion. We are born of this thing, made from it, and we will be returned to it in time. The great family of man. A profusion of errant flesh, multiplying, swarming, living, dying, until the stars align in their inexorable formation, and what sleeps is roused once more. To hatch from this fragile shell of earth and rock, and bring our inescapable end. So seek solace in a manner befitting your lineage, and take up your nugatory vigil, haunted forever by that sickening prose echoing through the infinite blackness of space and time. Ruin has come to our family.
I, as a player, chose to accept the challenge of the designers. I made decisions, I made sacrifices. With this ending, I get to watch all of that be undone. I get to see my character in the game, the heir of the estate, kill themselves, and futilely summon yet another heir. At the very end of the experience, the game strips me of all agency. I'll admit this is a fitting ending to an Eldritch horror, but then what is the point of choices like these?
And the whole game is about, can you get to the end of the quest before that happens? Or how much loss are you willing to stomach? If this is your favorite character, are you gonna, I think, what do they call it, gold breaking it or whatever, where, people always want their guys fully healed, don't want to make any risk. So you could get 1/3 in a dungeon and be like, screw this, I'm out. Whereas other people are like, I'm willing to lose 2 heroes to get through this. Even Ezekiel, when he lost that 3rd hero, he held it together pretty well. He knew he was trying to kill the Necromancer, and it was worth sacrificing characters.
It's hard to ask me as a player to be attached to my characters and make decisions over who lives and who dies, while simultaneously acknowledging that in the end, none of it matters. That's helplessness. That's Darkest Dungeon. I find that my thoughts on Darkest Dungeon somewhat echo those of some players of The Last of Us 2. I feel that the majority of players of that game have fallen into 2 distinct camps since its release. Those who feel that the ending was the satisfying conclusion to the story the game had been building, and those that feel that the ending didn't take the player's agency into account. Ultimately, I think that on the long list of things game designers have to keep in mind in order to deliver on a satisfying experience, the agency of the audience is going to become increasingly more important as we strive to deliver games with more meaningful stories. I hope that as we continue to make story-driven games, we also make games whose stories feel like they are driven by the player. This video was made as part of a campaign to help fund my tuition towards a game design education. Thank you for watching, and I would appreciate if you take a moment to look over the campaign and consider sharing or contributing to it, and I hope to see you in the next video.